All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Free Market Foundation. Thank you for being with us this evening. I'm going to introduce our speaker for tonight. Lamberti is the founder and strategist of ETM Micro Advisors, consulting to investors on macroeconomic and investment strategy. He is the co-author of When Money Destroys Nations, a book about Zimbabwe's hyperinflation collapse. Russell is a proud Austrian school economist, is published at Mises.org, and is a founding member of the South African chapter of the Mises Institute. He is also a council member at the Institute of Race Relations. He specializes in monetary systems and business psychoanalysis, and has participated in discussion forums with senior monetary policy officials of the South African Reserve Bank. Russell lives in Cape Town with his wife and children. Please welcome Russell Lamberti.
Thanks, Martin.
Sure.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the Free Market Foundation for hosting me, to Leon and his esteemed team. I appreciate you making the efforts at this time of day, which is always a little tricky. My topic this evening is one that is prone to being potentially quite heavy and a little depressing, but it doesn't. That's actually not entirely the case. The heading might suggest that we're in for a pessimism fest here tonight, but we need to extract as much realism out of the topic as possible, and get to a place of deeper understanding about where we are as a country and where we're going. The main message I have tonight really is that as difficult a situation as South Africa is in, it's still up for grabs. The fight is actually still on, and it's not a lost cause. And in fact, when I take you through some of the data a little bit later, as much as there's some depressing economic data, there's a lot to be thankful for in the way South Africa has been managed as well. And it means that we're not necessarily at that point of slipping over into something very catastrophic. That doesn't mean that can't happen either, but it means that it's really up for grabs now, and the fight is on, and we've got to, what I really want to say is that it's all hands on deck in terms of the intellectual battle that is on now in South Africa. We've got a cabal of very committed Marxists who run and control key nodes of government and of the state. That doesn't mean that they're the only people running government, but it means that they've been able to arrest fairly serious control over the levers of power. And as a result, we're sliding into a regulatory nightmare in a way that we can pull back from, and we need to desperately pull back from. And so rather than engaging in extreme pessimism, we've got to look at the reality of the situation and say that it is still up for grabs. There is a time in a country's trajectory when it can get lost, and when hope does disappear. And we're very far from that time in South Africa. And so that is kind of something that I want to just open with and set the stage for what I'm about to tell you regarding the second economy. I made a fairly long title, which gives the speaker quite a lot of license to go just about wherever he wants. But then you realize that there's actually a mistake because you're maybe a little less focused. But I think we can tie this together in quite a nice way. The first thing we need to deal with is this idea of what I call technocratic socialism. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on ideas and philosophy just very briefly before we get into some of the data. But we need to understand that we are facing now, and it's not just in South Africa, but it's globally, an ideology that is very shrewd and very clever. And it's something that I've called technocratic socialism. It's essentially socialism 2.0. And when you think back at how the old Bolsheviks and the Leninists went about went about their business in the early 1900s, what you realize is that they were actually strategically quite foolish. Because it wasn't a few decades later and that ideology had been massively discredited for all the pain and anguish that it had caused. And one of the reasons why is because what they did was in Marx's idea of controlling and owning the means of production, they thought that you actually had to seize the means of production and actually take control of it. But we know that ownership is really isn't about a title deed, is it? It's really about effective control. Who has effective control over these assets? And so if you can regulate, Ludwig von Mises called it, which has become almost a prosaic term now, but he called it interventionism. If you can regulate, you have effective control. If you read some of the clauses in the mining charter, you realize that who has the effective control? It's not the mining houses, is it? It's actually the regulatory body, and it's actually the government who has effective control over procurement, over hiring practices, over equity. And so you start to see that this very clever new socialism, which I call technocratic socialism, which is gaining control, but leaving the title deeds in the hands of the capitalists and letting them get down and do the dirty work of actually trying to make a profitable business in a very difficult environment. And you exercise increasing control through the regulatory arm. And I think that this is something that is very underappreciated, not only in South Africa but in the rest of the world. You know, it's amazing how much pushback you get when you tell people that we are living in a socialist type state right now in South Africa with a Marxist underpinning ideology. People kind of laugh you out the room because they've got a caricature of what Marxism should look like, right, and what socialism should look like. They're imprinting a kind of 1922 Russia onto a modern day South Africa. But this is a very, very clever and insidious form of socialism, and I think you're seeing it right across the world. And I actually think that some of the political turmoil that you've seen in Europe, in the US, the surprising political results that have emerged there are people getting increasingly disgruntled and disillusioned with this bureaucratic, technocratic elite that has bulged out, is essentially unproductive, and is basically controlling and regulating more and more areas of people's lives. And so this is underpinned by what I would call a kind of Marxism 2.0. That's the sort of philosophical underpinning. And if you think about what happened in the Marxist ideology, there was essentially a pivot, wasn't there, around about the 1960s, when Stalin had done such a great job of discrediting the Soviet experiment. The postmodernists came in and pivoted these Marxist ideas, and instead of having an adversary between an adversarial relationship between worker and bourgeoisie, that's also not a very smart form of Marxism, right? Because a worker can become someone in the middle class and can become wealthy, and the capitalist system through the 20th century showed that people actually started to progress. Hey, I was a worker, now I'm in the middle class, I'm actually moving on, I'm building some wealth. This was a devastating blow to this antagonistic class relationship that Marx had posited. But what if you can create differences between people that they can't surmount? And this was something that my friend Chris and I were speaking about the other day. What if you make the adversarial relationship male and female? What if you make the adversarial relationship black and white? What if you make the adversarial relationship something that can't actually be surmounted? So if you combine that postmodern power analysis that cannot be surmounted, and you add it with this technocratic, bureaucratic type socialism where you just surreptitiously and cleverly regulate to gain control of the means of production, you have a very insidious form of intervention. And I believe that South Africa is smack bang in the middle of that right now, and the results are clear to see. I'm going to show you some of those results now in the numbers. But we're in a stagnant economy. We're being left behind, even in this fairly distorted and generally badly managed global economy. We're still being left behind. And I think it's very much the case that we're suffering from this disease of Marxism 2.0 and technocratic socialism. It's quite amazing that after this ANC conference that's just been held, this mini policy conference that we had late June, early July, they produced how many pages of ideology and policy recommendations do you think came out of that conference? I'll tell you, it was 220 pages. on a 1-week conference. And when you read through it, it's basically rambling Marxist analysis of our history as a country and where we need to be going. What was quite fascinating is I actually read some of this stuff, not all 220 pages, I'm not that masochistic, but certainly some of the key stuff. And one of the things that you see is the utter totalitarianism of the government that leads us. At one point they say, South Africa's efforts at fundamental change represent a social experiment. Because we know social experiments always work out well, don't they? In the past, and then it says, South Africa is this is to quote the ANC, South Africa is a giant social laboratory. The success or failure of whose undertakings has global implications. These guys are not about distributed Hayekian order. They're about centralized social experimentation, central planning. We have one vision for the country, and that's the vision we are pursuing. There's no room for plurality in that, in the ANC Marxian analysis. Later they go on to say the ANC's ultimate objectives go much further. This is, by the way, when they're talking about how much the NDP, the National Development Plan, lines up with the National Democratic Revolution and ANC policy. The NDP is, of course, it was supposedly endorsed by business and so on, but it is, of course, a very socialist central planning document. But they go on to say the ANC's ultimate objectives go further than the NDP, informed by a strategic posture to build a new civilization. Wow, these guys are not playing around with their rhetoric and with where they want to take things. Now, hats off to them for some ambition, but how about we just govern and respect the rule of law and fix the potholes? But it's a new civilization that we're after under the ANC Marxian analysis. So I think this is something that's clearly important. And when you read through a lot of this analysis, what gets called to mind is that great book by Robert Higgs, written in the late 80s, called Crisis and Leviathan, which was essentially the essence of that theory, was that governments pounce on crises to grow. And so if governments love getting attacked by another country, right, because they can declare martial law, they can suck more resources into the state. Do you think government really gets smaller after the war? Maybe a little bit, but it's kind of something like this, right? They love financial crises, they love economic crises because you can suck more resources into the state. The big ideological sort of underpinning of a lot of what the ANC are doing is that capitalism failed in 2008 and 9 in the global financial crisis. Now that's a nonsense analysis, by the way, and we can maybe do another talk on that some other time. I don't want to go into that. But capitalism failed. They love that. They pounced on that. China is winning, and China's communist. Also nonsense, okay? A, China's not winning that much, and B, China freed a few 100 million people from agricultural serfdom 30 years ago. Of course it's doing well, okay? And where China's not going well is where it's creating huge amounts of distortions in its banking system, and will face, I think, a very difficult period. But the point is that the ANC have pounced on this meta-narrative of capitalism fails, communism's done well. They're very wedded to this situation, and they're using this to drive home this high moral high ground on the agenda that they're bringing forth. And so you're seeing very much this crisis and Leviathan type ratcheting up of the size of the state, and I'll show you about that in a bit. So let's get on to some of the numbers. So how have our friends Rob Davies and our SACP acolytes been doing in their positions of great economic authority? Bear in mind, they've blamed, as the data's come in, it's that they can't hide away from the bad economic data. So they're blaming the financial crisis for creating a lingering drag on South African growth, and they're also blaming the fall in commodity prices. The Venezuelans also do that, so it should tell you that it's not the best strategy. Okay, so this is South Africa's GDP. This is our real GDP rebased to 100 in 1970. So And this is on a log scale. So every time you go past a notch here, you're seeing our GDP double. So we had a very big, strong boom time in the 1960s. It was under a fairly stable Bretton Woods arrangement. It was the post-war global boom. So GDP just about doubled in about 10, 15 years. Very, very rapid growth. It then took us 30 years to double the real GDP again. So that's what slow growth does. It really slows down your development path. You know, that miracle of compounding on the upside is the pain of compounding on the other side, right? When you're not keeping up with growth. And these were the political dark days of the 1980s, where we had eventually just stagnation into the 90s. And what's quite nice, you don't often see a GDP chart represented like this. It's just clean and simple, real GDP growth, real GDP in its absolute terms over time. And you can see this big arc that we got from growth to stagnation. And I think it looks like we're on a very, very similar arc right now. We're on a growth into stagnation arc that I think is turning into a depressionary sort of trend. But don't think of the Great Depression, where it's utter depravity and collapse, but it's certainly turning into a rolling kind of depression from a GDP perspective. Now what's important about this is that when you fall behind in these low growth years over here, when your GDP just goes nowhere for a while, the rest of the world keeps growing and you actually fall behind, and it's very difficult to ever catch up. And as a result, we become a less and less important part of the global economy. We're now about 0.3 or 0.4% of global GDP, an effective rounding error. We should be about 1% of global GDP given our population and our potential. So compare us to the world. Well, that's what the world's done. So while we were messing around in the 80s, the world kept powering ahead, and that was arguably one of the reasons why that political change came when it did, because we were just so evidently falling behind, and I think it became glaring to so many people at the time. When we had these good growth years from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s, we just kept pace with the rest of the world. To catch up, you've got to do something exceptional. And we've not really done anything exceptional. We got a lot of luck from commodities there, it's true. And now we're on this stagnation arc again as the world grows. Now, let's call China's GDP numbers slightly fictitious, and maybe discount some of global growth as a result. And maybe this red line's not quite so hot, but the point is that we continue to fall behind the rest of the world. So that's the big picture trajectory. If you look at since 2007, so 2007 is a nice year to take, because if you take some of this analysis from 2008 or 9, you catch it right in the trough of what was a big recession or depression. It's one of the reasons why Obama's presidency looks so great, right? Because he took it over pretty much at rock bottom, and the Fed printed a whole lot of money, and Obama created 5 million jobs or something like that. But it's quite easy to do when you get at the trough. So we take it from 2007, just before everyone went into the financial crisis. Also gives us the ability to see how did countries do in the financial crisis, and how have they done since. So what you're looking at here is the median of an emerging market peer group that comprises of Brazil, Chile, Colombia, India, Mexico, Thailand, and Turkey. Chosen that spread because it's geographically quite diverse. There's some commodity-dependent countries in there. There's some non-commodity-dependent countries, and countries that are developed to a greater or lesser degree. But basically emerging markets. Chile is sort of straddling emerging into developed. So real disposable income per person in dollars has risen over the last 10 years by 50%. That's astonishing. That's really impressive. That's the EM peer median. Where do you think South Africa will come in on this? It's ugly, guys. It's ugly. That's where we are. So the EM peer group is dramatically outperforming South Africa. So sorry, Rob Davies. It's not the global financial crisis' fault. It's not commodity prices' fault either. Colombia is a very commodity-sensitive economy. They've made tremendous reforms in the last 10, 20 years, and they've shrugged off a lot of these problems. So I think we can fairly resoundingly say that this excuse the whole time about the weak global economy is really weak. Now, by the way, this is not a presentation to be an apologist for everything that other emerging markets are doing. Turkey's president is pretty crazy. There's some really weird things going on in Brazil, and Brazil is is dealing with a huge corruption scandal. I mean, these economies have serious dysfunctional issues, but at core, there's enough freedom within these systems and small enough government for these economies to be unleashed and to grow. And I'll show that to you in a few slides. Now, one contention amongst some of the Keynesians and some of the Marxists in South Africa is, well, fiscal policy wasn't loose enough, and monetary policy wasn't loose enough. Well, monetary policy has been pretty good in South Africa, I would say, but it's been as loose or tight as most of these other emerging markets. Real interest rates in South Africa spent a long time over the last few years at 0, and that's very loose monetary policy. In terms of fiscal policy, if you exclude Chile, which has ramped up its debt dramatically, but off a very low base. Chile started the financial crisis period with about 5% debt to GDP levels. I mean, astonishingly low. And it's ramped those up quite a bit. But if you exclude Chile, that's been the percentage increase in government debt. So fiscal policy is not loose. I mean, it's not tight, should I say. It's incredibly loose compared to the emerging market peer group. And of course, one of the great devastations is that we've got so little to show for all this debt that we've been saddled with. We entered the financial crisis at about 500 billion rands worth of public debt, national government debt, and we're now sitting at about 2.3 trillion rand. So it's an incredible increase in public debt with, I would argue, very, very little to show for it. And one of the big culprits, of course, is business regulation. Now, you get these surveys by the Fraser Institute and the Heritage Foundation. They're not perfect. They certainly have their flaws and their limitations, but they give you some interesting insight into how our economies are being regulated and how free those economies are. And the one thing you can see since the turn of the century is that business freedom this is the change in our business freedom index since the turn of the century. So we've fallen dramatically. So the late 90s was just a really good time, relatively low business regulation, relatively free economy. What's particularly concerning in these latest surveys by the Heritage Foundation is that South Africa's business freedom score is actually falling quite quickly now. And I also just wonder if they're better getting a handle on things like mining charters and the intricacies of very onerous BEE regulations and so on that are making the business regulatory environment very, very difficult. But the other very simple and big elephant in the room is that our government is simply too big for the kind of economy that we have. And let me I want to make a point about Scandinavian countries, right? Because this is important, because that gets thrown back at libertarians a lot, and we need to deal with it. But the one thing to say about having a big government is that it gives you very little margin for error. Okay, when you've got a vibrant, strong, large, distributed order of private sector players, that's a very robust system. When you centralize decision making, your margin for error falls very quickly. And so what you get in Scandinavia are countries that have diminished that error term, significantly. So they're able to run these very large governments with high tax rates, okay, but they get a whole lot of other things spot on, and they have to, because if they don't, a 40-50% of GDP government is going to topple you. It's a very, very onerous and very it creates a very fragile system. So if you look at Scandinavia, they're some of the freest economies in the world. If you look, where do they come on the economic freedom rankings? Top 20. One or two might even be in the top 15 or 10. They're very free, and they have, so for example, trade regulation in places like Sweden is almost perfectly free. There's very low regulatory burdens, very low, for example, capital controls, and the other thing to say about those countries and large developed market welfare states in general is that you have to get rich before you can create a welfare state, right? You have to actually create a whole lot of wealth, and then you can take a holiday from history and sort of sit back for a few decades and distribute this largesse. I mean, that's essentially what's happened in places like Sweden, the UK, and even the US. And I mean, the jury's out on how successful that is, right? I mean, they're now stagnant economies with piles of debt. There's a lot of sclerosis in those economies, right? They're not exactly dynamic places. But at least they got rich. If you go look at Sweden, in the 18 and early 1900s, it was an incredibly free market system with a very, very small government. I mean, if government got above 10% of GDP in the 1800s, it was big. You know, so we need to understand the context of where your Scandinavian countries came from and how they were then able to roll out these large welfare states in, I might add, very ethnically and culturally homogenous, high trust economies, right? So we've got very different situations. I think what you're seeing in South Africa, the attempt to create a welfare state, is just utterly cart before the horse. Okay, we need to realize that we've got to have a very free, small government system to create a lot of wealth. Maybe in 2060, after we've done that and had tremendous success, we can have a discussion about creating a put your feet up welfare state for the next few decades. And so if you look at the size of government, this is the size of government spending as a percentage of GDP. The data is a bit patchy on some of the other emerging markets. And you can see, a place like Mexico, this dotted red line, has risen, from under 15% of GDP to about 20%. This is India over here. But South Africa has come from a place of relatively small government to a very large government. And when government is deciding 1 in 3 rand, how 1 in 3 rand is spent, and that's just the bare basics of how much government is involved in the economy, right? Because regulations and all sorts of other interventions take that way higher. So we're sitting with a far too big a state for a country that is not rich enough yet to really afford such a big government. And because you don't have a lot of margin for error when you've got a big government, you have to be really on the button. And South Africa's just got way too much error, right? So way too much error in SOEs, way too much error in governance. If you have a big government, you have to have a pretty brutal, if you excuse the term, meritocracy. I mean, you really do. If you want to have a capable big state, you've got to be really, really uncompromising about having a professional bureaucracy that's utterly meritocratic. And so we just make too many errors, and so we really need to be at least somewhere down here below 20% of GDP. That means in rands and cents, that means government giving up at least 500 billion rand a year out of the budget, giving it back to the dynamic sectors, taking it out of the sclerotic sectors, pushing it back into places where it can be channeled much more productively and much more expertly. Now, we can have a separate discussion about the politics of how we get there, but that's the kind of quantum that you're looking at. We're wasting probably 500 to 700 billion rand a year at least. If it was up to me, government would be somewhere down there. In fact, government wouldn't fit on this chart if it was up to me. But the point is, there's a huge overhang of utterly unproductive resources that are being siphoned out of the private sector. Okay, so that's where we are. That's the bad stuff. Let's talk about life after the downgrade, because my first comments on life after the junk downgrade is that it's not nearly as bad as has been advertised. And you get what I would call corporate memeonomics, where some corporate executive team just heard some economist from some bank talk about something, and it must mean that when we get the junk downgrade, interest rates go up because we're worse quality borrowers, and that's what happens, right? I mean, the empirical data just doesn't bear that out. Things actually go the other way. And one of the reasons why you actually often get lower interest rates after these junk downgrades is because most of the high interest rate pain happens before the downgrade. And this brings us to understanding what a ratings agency is, right? A ratings agency, if it was a genuine leading indicator, would not be a ratings agency, it would be an investment bank, okay? A ratings agency is an after-the-fact rubber stamper, and we want them to be that. We want them to be conservative. We want them to take their time and take a whole lot of information into account and then say, okay, yes, South Africa is a junk grade. But I mean, if you genuinely think that 3 ratings agencies who have this rubber stamping mandate determine the fate of a country, I mean, you're really on the wrong track. Okay, the ratings agencies are simply there to reflect some degree of, the degree of reality to the best of their ability. And so our downgrade in this country, I think, really happened in early 2016, late 2015, when Nene was sacked, and the rand really took a huge dive. Because why? Because the plaster of supposed exceptionalism in South African policy making as an emerging market was ripped off very quickly. And we realized that the rule of law was not such a big thing in SA anymore, and the rule of man was starting to become far more and more prominent. And so that was, I think, essentially our downgrade. And 12 to 15 months later, the ratings agencies sort of confirmed it with a rubber stamp. That's really what happened in the last 2-3 years, guys. And so the ratings firms are a lagging indicator. They're not the ones who are determining our fate. And the second thing to say is that getting a junk downgrade is like getting a slap on the wrist. And it's better to have a slap on the wrist if you're doing something wrong than to not, right? That's the point of a slap on the wrist. And so the point is that we can start moving to a place of some fiscal discipline. Now, the latest numbers, which I don't have to show you here, show that we're actually slowing down our rate of government spending, quite rapidly at the moment. Now, partly that's because tax intake is very weak as well. But it's quite encouraging to see that we're not just off to the races. Malusi Gigaba is not just putting the throttle down and we're flying into fiscal heaven. There's a measure of restraint, which is encouraging. And then from an economic perspective, it's just to say that because the ratings are lagging indicators, you get huge amounts of your move in the markets happen before the downgrade. Okay, when did the rand do most of its weakening? Before or after the downgrade? Before the downgrade, of course, because are the currency markets going to be behind the ratings agencies? Of course not. Your bond yields spiked, your interest rates went up before the downgrade. And in fact, what we see in a whole lot of countries that we've studied that have been downgraded from investment grade to junk grade, interest rates actually fall quite substantially. And this is a bit more interesting for some of the more sort of investment professionals in this audience. But in terms of life after the downgrade, these are a bunch of countries that we've studied who've been downgraded from investment grade to junk at various different stages over the last 20 years. And if you rebase their interest rates to the spread of their interest rates over American interest rates to 1%, you see that after the downgrade, they actually compress to about somewhere around, depending, but about half of that level. So in other words, our interest rates after a downgrade tend to actually fall. They actually tend to squeeze and get the spread between American interest rates and our interest rates actually compresses, and they tend to fall in absolute terms. And one of the reasons is because, the very key reason here is that because all those moves happen before the downgrade, markets are self-correcting. Thank goodness. I think we believe that in the Free Market Foundation. Markets eventually correct these errors that have been built up, and so when you get a very weak rand, you get high interest rates. What happens? Banks are very scared to lend money. Your credit growth slows. Your money supply growth slows, and that means that you actually start having very low inflation that starts to emerge in the economy. Everyone's quite nervous, so they're holding on to cash, and inflation starts to fall. And as inflation falls, central banks and bond markets quite like that. They like the fact that your economy is now starting to readjust. They like the fact that you're not running these huge, gargantuan, big trade deficits anymore, which were funded by borrowing because you're borrowing less. So that's all actually really good news. Now, it manifests initially as usually bad growth, and maybe you get a recession. But these are actually healthy, corrective dynamics in an economic system. And so it's not that surprising that after a downgrade, you actually see interest rates fall. So when it comes to life after the downgrade, I would say that it's, this idea of now we're junk, so what does South Africa look like as junk? And we talk about, it's going to take 5 years. On average, it takes 5 years to get back your investment grade status. I mean, we just got to put all that to one side and say, is our economy correcting or not? And so far, it actually is. Okay, now this is where we get to the VeneZimbabwe scorecard, because if you let that correction happen and you manage macroeconomic policy prudently and soundly, you can actually get through this alive, right? You can get through this okay in pretty good shape. And the fact that you were once downgraded to junk is actually pretty meaningless in the big scheme of things. And so we've got to now ask that question is, how do we react now? Because all these countries, Colombia, Croatia, Brazil, Russia, Hungary, who got downgraded at some point over the last 20 years, broadly speaking, managed their macroeconomic conditions sensibly. Not always, not entirely, not perfectly, but basically sensibly, not like Venezuela and like Zimbabwe. Okay, so we now do get to that key question of where do we sit in that continuum of failed state, utterly corrupt macroeconomic management, and hyperinflation eventually in these very extreme, badly managed scenarios. And so we're going to go on to a little bit of that now. The sauciest, perhaps, part of the title of this talk. I like to mash up words. It's a bit of an affliction that I have. So VeneZimbabwe just rolls off the tongue quite nicely. And of course, we know what we're talking about when we talk about VeneZimbabwe, right? We're talking about a situation where you get essentially the rule of klepto-Marxism, and klepto-Marxists always eventually end up at the central bank, right? That's the money tree. It always is. And so that's where klepto-Marxists go. And if you get enough klepto-Marxism, you get what I call necro-Marxism, which is, you screw an economy even after it's dead. But so that's kind of where these guys take it, right? So we gotta get a sense of where is South Africa in this continuum. So stick with klepto-Marxism. There's basically two ways initially that you would get a hyperinflation. The initial reason for it, the very underlying cause, essentially would be, the single underlying cause, right, is that you have an utterly devastated economy that you then need to start printing money to kind of try and stay alive, and that's where the klepto-Marxists eventually get to the central bank. And then, of course, the money printing takes the economic spiral even worse and then destroys your economy. But what causes the initial reason to go after the central bank? And there's basically usually just two reasons. The one is war, and the other one is klepto-Marxism. So Marxism is as or more damaging than war. I mean, no question about that. And hyperinflations are probably more damaging than war as well. I mean, getting bombed for a few days is actually peanuts compared to going through a 10-year hyperinflation cycle where you get utterly destroyed. So let's put war aside. War was what afflicted Weimar Germany to a large extent, and many of the hyperinflations of the last century happened during that war period. But most of the hyperinflations that have happened since, with the odd exception, have been a klepto-Marxism problem. And that's really what we're trying to assess in South Africa. Because when you get into these very, very bad Zimbabwe, Venezuela type scenarios, the degree of political and institutional decay we must not underestimate. It is very, very severe. And I think the one thing I would say is that for all the talk of state capture and for all the talk of how clearly badly managed South Africa is, we're not at that level of decrepitude yet. I mean, the decay of the institutional and legal decay to get into a full-blown kind of hyperinflationary, unfettered money printing scenario is pretty extreme. And I'll show you how that plays out in a bit. But to show you the extremities of what can happen in some of these economies, the next chart I'm going to show you is the Venezuelan exchange rate. The official exchange rate, which is a work of fiction, the greatest work of fiction this century, which is 10 bolivar to the dollar, okay, and the black market exchange rate, which is otherwise known as the free market exchange rate, is sitting at a cool 8,821. So I've inverted the chart so you get a sense of the depreciation. Normally we look at these charts and they go up. So the black market rate is, the official rate is obviously just a silly rate where the cronies can trade at. So if you need to get something in from overseas and you're part of the political clique and part of the crony class, you can buy it at 10 bolivar to the dollar. But of course, for all the plebs, you're trading at something more like 8,800 bolivar to the dollar. And this is essentially what a hyperinflationary currency crisis, genuine currency collapse looks like. So it does put into perspective a little bit the severity of moving from 10 rand to the dollar to 16 rand to the dollar, which wouldn't even register on this chart. Not to trivialize currency weakness, but these are the kinds of levels of depravity that you get to. And by the way, these can be this problem can be halted and reversed with enough political pressure and political will. But when you've got just the utter unfettered corruption of a political system, which Venezuela has unfortunately become, and which we know Zimbabwe became, you get this moving to unprecedented levels. So the question really is in South Africa is where are we? And I like to think of this on a bit of a continuum. Now this is a busy chart, so don't try and read everything on it yet. Just relax. But the first thing I want to show you is that there's two axes here, right? There's an axis going up and there's an axis going across. And the one going up, on the one side you've got monetary corruption, and over here you've got monetary stability, i.e. we're okay with just printing boatloads of money and wrecking the currency, and we're not. We're actually going to have a system of a reasonable banking system, a properly monitored central bank, and so on. And then on this axis you've got a state-led economy and a market-led economy. And this puts you into 4 quadrants, and they're described by these sorts of conditions. Now, where we want to be is up here, right? We want to be in a system that's market-led with a stable monetary environment. Ideally, a free market money environment, right? But if we're going to have monopolized, nationalized fiat currencies, let's at least not inflate them away. So that's where we would like to sit. And various countries sit all over this map based on their kind of political economy dynamics. And I think South Africa, the big battle in the ANC right now is not about getting to here. It's more like, which one of these do we choose? There's wide agreement within the ANC and all these factions in the ANC that we need a state-led economy. It's really now about how we're going to go about that. That's, I think, a large part of the debate. And you get what I call SRET and then FRET. Okay, SRET is slow radical economic transformation, and FRET is fast radical economic transformation, where you essentially go into this bottom quadrant and you've got a state-led economy, but you also, because you're klepto-Marxist, you've gotten hold of the central bank, and you're trying to fast-track your civilizational utopian plan. And so you essentially, you get depressions, you get hyperinflations, you get acute social angst if you go far enough down this road. So, for me, South Africa entered into this blue zone in probably the first 10 years after 1994, and has slowly drifted. We've kept our monetary stability reasonably, but we've drifted into this zone over here. And this is quite a depressing zone because you sort of sit in the stagnation economy. You're not actually mismanaging your currency or your monetary policy per se, but you've got this huge regulatory burden that continues to hurt you. So I mean, I see this choice as like the choice between arsenic and cyanide. I mean, obviously you're going to clamor for arsenic, but so when we laud Pravin Gordhan for only putting us in 1.7 trillion rands worth of extra debt, what a great finance minister, and I wish we could have him as finance minister again. And when we laud this breakaway communist faction, I mean, we're essentially clamoring for arsenic, right? Because obviously, we don't want to go the cyanide route and slip into this monetary disaster as well. And I get that. So the debate is happening in this part of the plane. Now, that's not to say that every single person in the ANC is here, right? I think that there's agitators for the other side, and they've been silenced, and they're struggling to find a voice. And so I recognize that it's a broad tent, okay? But this is essentially where I think a lot of the debate is taking place. And I think we're over here still. Okay, so we're still in slow radical economic transformation. The central bank is fighting capture now. I call it Saab wars. Okay, we've got Saab wars right now, and there's this clear, very much out in the open push to capture the central bank. That's where klepto-Marxists like to end up at the money tree. Okay, so that's definitely happening, but we do have institutional protection of this bank. We do have pushback, and so far, it's actually being well managed. And in fact, South Africa's money supply growth, some would argue, is too low. I think it's just right. It's flat. We've had no money supply growth for the last 6 months. I mean, that would be pretty much ideal in a Bitcoin economy come 2025. On 21 million Bitcoin, you would have no monetary inflation. I think we'd do quite well on that. So from the perspective of where we are right now, the VeneZimbabwe scenario, mechanically, monetarily speaking, we're not there. But clearly we have signs of this political and institutional decay. I mean, clearly we have. We don't need to elaborate on that. And there is this increasing desire for capture of these institutions. I just want to show you one or two more charts and then I'm done. So the next chart is really just to show you how bad the monetary corruption gets. So money supply is an important variable. How much money is actually in the economy? And we know if you flood an economy with money, you're going to create a lot of inflation. So we've actually created less new money than the United States has, relatively speaking. Obviously, they've created tons of dollars. But from a relative growth perspective, we've created less money than the United States. And both of us pale in comparison to some of these other economies, right? So this is a log scale again. If you appreciate log scales, you know that every time you, on this particular one, every time you cross one of these points, you're getting 10 times bigger each time on money supply. Okay, so this is a pretty radical chart if you understand log scales, right? So South Africa and America, since 2007-8, have increased money supply 200 or 300%. It's pretty high. It's not hyperinflationary at all. And it doesn't speak to any kind of major monetary corruption. I mean, of course, modern central banks are essentially corrupt in the sense that they have a monopoly on fiat currency and they print it out of thin air. But basically, this is decent management. And this is, of course, why there's been no hyperinflation in America, as many people predicted. Because even though we saw trillions, the word trillions sparks this notion of hyperinflation, but it's off a very big monetary base in the United States. And so we haven't actually had anything like the kind of inflation in the money supply that you'd need to see. So Venezuela has gone quite berserk. I mean, it's increased money supply 100-fold over the last 10 years, which is phenomenal. And I've just put on here what happened to Zimbabwe. So this is like Zimbabwe's chart from the late 90s, sort of superimposed over this time frame. And then Brazil, I mean, very few people know that Brazil went berserk in the 1980s and 1990s. It created very, very high inflation. Now, this is interesting. So Brazil looks worse than Zim, right? If you take this chart just a little bit forward, like about a year or 18 months forward, Brazil had started to correct its problems in 94, 95, started to get those problems under control, and Brazil's money supply flattened out and became normal again. But it was at this time, I mean, we're already at a 1,000,000-fold increase, but Zim started going crazy. So it was really the last 12, 18 months of that Zimbabwean hyperinflation where you got the 1 times 10 to the power of 25, kind of inflations. I don't even know how to say the, octillion or something, but it was absolutely berserk. So the lesson there as well is that you can pull these things back. You don't have to go all, full Zimbabwe. You can, Brazil actually pulled it back. And Brazil didn't suffer the utter depravity of what you ended up getting in the latter part of that Zimbabwean hyperinflation. So it's a very, very interesting kind of topic, but the point is we're nowhere near that right now. And the thing that I would sort of comfort you with is just to say that if we are going to go down this track, you can see it and you can start to perceive it very, very early. You don't wake up one morning and there's a hyperinflation. These things take time. And the decay and the institutional decay will become very apparent if that's the road we're going to go. I'm not making a prediction on that tonight. We can have maybe that as a separate discussion. So the final thing I want to say to you, this is a fairly sort of intricate picture, so I want to just focus your attention at the bottom here. Because central banks can essentially be on two extremes or somewhere in between, and those extremes are they a banker's central bank or are they a politician's central bank? And if they're a banker's central bank, they're generally going to behave prudently, sensibly, to keep the banking system intact, to make sure that banks are not overextending themselves. By and large, that's how those central banks operate. But central banks can get captured and they can become political toys of politicians, and then they become politicians' central banks. And so the Reserve Bank is, in my mind, still most certainly a banker's central bank. And we need to watch for this potential slide to wholly politician central bank. And that's part of this process of monetary and political corruption. And you'll be able to pick it up in the money supply numbers usually, because as you start, so there's some fairly technical terminology. I don't worry too much about that, but these are essentially just aspects of central banking that can come under sort of some degree of control of political interests. And as you start moving in these squares across, the state of capture to total capture, and therefore the central bank getting unmoored from being a banker's central bank and moving across the lake to moor itself as a politician's central bank, that's what we've really, really got to look for, because that's really important, right? Once that move starts happening, currency confidence really starts to take a knock. Suddenly 30 rand to the dollar becomes very, very easy to achieve, right? And these are all, so we've really got to watch this, because you can see, I showed you that Venezuelan currency. When the stuff really gets unhinged, by the time it's over here, you're too late, right? You're already at 1,000 rand to the dollar, and you're kind of off to the races. Now, I'm not predicting that that's where we're going, but I'm just saying this is what we really got to watch out for. That's the kind of thing we've got to be paying attention to as we look at this political kind of milieu and what's at stake in terms of the political corruption of the country. And then I just want to leave you with this idea of technology. It's a bit of a parting shot, and unfortunately you won't be able to spend a lot of time on it, but I just wonder if people are ever going to suffer as much again under a hyperinflation as they have in the past, and I don't think they will. We've got such incredible technology nowadays. Even the Zim hyperinflation, which was so recent, 99 to 09, it was that decade. We didn't really have smartphones. Smartphones sort of arrived right at the back end of that decade. We didn't have cryptocurrency. Also, right at the back end of that decade did cryptocurrency arrive. So very little opportunity and option for people suffering under the yoke of a nationalized legal tender currency that was getting printed into oblivion. Very difficult for people to actually escape that mayhem. Nowadays, there's far more opportunity for them to escape. In the book that we wrote about Zimbabwe, we talk about how people resorted to tokens as alternative forms of currency, because the Zim dollar was just a useless, medium of exchange, unit of account, store of value. So people started using fuel tokens, having a token that was redeemable in fuel. Well, there's a very, very interesting new kind of token that has arrived in the world in the last 6 or 7 years, and that's a cryptocurrency. They are essentially tokens, protected and secured by cryptography. Very difficult to understand, but very, very interesting, and probably the most secure form of money that we've ever had, and that will continue to improve and be developed, and the security around that will get even better. So I think cryptocurrency is a fascinating dynamic, and I would leave you with that, because we don't have to, I think, be trapped in the rand. We don't have to sit and hold this currency while some crazy central banker prints it into oblivion. There are now genuinely many, many options to escape these kinds of problems, and you may actually get the death of fiat currency might be a whimper. It might die with a bit of a whimper as people just transition into this really great parallel sound money, free market money system. So I leave you with that optimism, and I thank you very much for your time. Thank you. And I'm sure I took too long, but yeah, I would welcome any questions. So you're welcome to. So I saw that hand first, and then I'll go to you.
Russell, if you were going to give us a list of priorities of what we should do to try and get things better, can you give me your top 3 or 4? Would you be worried about maintaining the monetary supply, or would you be worried about SOEs and regulation in terms of labour or something? Supposing the ANC said, come and tell me what to do now, I can only do a few things. What would be your top 4 or 5?
So, as much as I am a stickler for monetary reform, I think that our Reserve Bank is not being mismanaged enough, to put it at the top of the priority list. I would say that confiscating 1.3 trillion rand from people every year and throwing it into a hopelessly mismanaged pot of misspending and misappropriation has got to be where we start. So let's, putting political reality perhaps just to one side for a little bit, but we have to figure out a way to get the size of government down. Now, pragmatically, maybe 10 or 15% is too much to ask, but we got to say that we got to get to somewhere like 20% of GDP again, which we got to, by the way. We got to under Mbeki. We got to get the size of government. If we get a 10 percentage points of GDP smaller, we save 400 billion rand, in the fiscus that goes back into the dynamic sector. So part of that is essentially spending cuts, tax cuts, but not George Bush type tax cuts where you cut the tax and don't cut the spending, and then hope that you grow into it. Right? You got to cut the spending, and then cut the taxes, and possibly cut the taxes a little slower so that you run maybe even small surpluses or at least a balanced budget. So I think tax cuts are key. I think that this regulatory web of intricate and draconian BEE rules, mining charter nonsense, all these micro regulations, and some, a lot of it operated by unelected bodies that we don't really know too much about, that are very opaque, like the Financial Services Board, who are introducing something called Twin Peaks that adds many, many layers of regulatory sludge into a sector that's actually being quite well regulated and well managed. So I think that we've just got far too much regulation, and I would say that we could take a very blunt axe to a huge swath of it. As part of the cutting the size of government, I would love to relieve the Minister of Sport of his job and just axe that department entirely, right? Why do we need a Ministry of Sport, government to oversee how we play sport? It's utterly ridiculous. So there's lots of fat that can be cut. Whole departments, and this is not about tweaking a tax rate from 40% to 38% or 37.5%, 38 or 37.5%. I don't know. We've got to go. You got to go big and bold. This it really is. Leon often talks about it. Yes, we do need radical economic transformation, but not of the kind that's being spoken about, right? So a corporate tax, if you drop it from if you drop the top marginal tax rate from 40 or 44, whatever it is these days, to 43 or 42. This is just fiddling while Rome burns, right? You've got to take a big axe to it, 15 percentage points off, you smack it. And that's just your first pass, and then you do another round a few years later. So I think that's key. The other thing I would say is that we do need to run, and this does go back to the monetary policy side, is we do need to run a positive real interest rate policy. We need interest rates to be higher, borrowing to be harder, but better quality. This notion that the poor need to be banked so that they can get credit. No, we don't need to be squeezing and shoving more credit into the poor. The poor need jobs. They need savings, not debt. They need an income, not more leverage in the banking system. So we need prudent, high interest rate monetary policy, which you can countervail in terms of its because you're going to make people's lives a little more difficult if you raise rates. You're going to hurt their mortgage payments. So that's where you bring in your tax cuts. Give people these great tax cut relief, and you're going to balance that out very nicely. And then the final thing I want to say about this is just that we are a xenophobic, kind of mercantilist country from a policy perspective. If something's made overseas, it's a bit like Donald Trumpism when it comes to trade, right? This idea that the Chinese are flooding our system with products. We need to be far more open. So I would cut all trade tariffs. You don't need trade tariffs. We've got export restrictions, we've got import restrictions. You get rid of all that. Free trade is absolutely vital. But possibly even more importantly than that is we've got to be much more welcoming to foreigners, to actual people. So yes, let's welcome goods, but let's welcome humans as well. having people with capital to come and live in this beautiful country. I mean, who wouldn't want to move here from some of the lesser nice parts of the world? Move to South Africa. We need to create a far more welcoming environment. And as part of that, the final thing to say, and Martin will like this, but if government's going to do one thing, it's got to keep us safe. And so when it comes to policing and defense and making sure that we don't have 15,000 murders every year and all the rest of it, that is utterly critical. So I would say that you scrap the Department of Sport and a whole lot of others that I can't a whole lot of others that I can't think of. Not that policing necessarily needs more money; it needs better quality, but maybe more money too. And you drive that police force to create an incredibly safe environment in this country. You start putting some of those things together, even 20% of the degree to what I would hope they would be. But if you just start moving in that direction, you'll start seeing the dividend, I think, very, very quickly. Okay, so I must go there first, and then I'll come to you guys. Yes.
I think you make the case very well. I mean, we've got a socialist state in South Africa, and I think it's becoming more aware of this. And if you doctrinaire a socialist state, and I think South Africa is probably getting there, in the end, the state only survives by looting assets.
Yeah.
Socialism ends up in looting. The state has to loot assets in order to finance its capacity. It needs a lot of money. It can't raise money normal ways, so it just takes state capture and starts taking assets and land ownership and land grabs and all the rest. So we're in that phase now in South Africa. In the old days, I mean, the Van Hayeks and all the rest, when the debates were going on, they said, well, this would end up in decades of eventually the road to serfdom.
Yes.
The state would be inefficient and you'd end up all as serfs. I mean, Winston Churchill said socialism is serfdom, and he wasn't an economist. Now in this modern era, that's why it's interesting towards the end, where you started looking at this sort of social media and stuff like that. In South Africa, we're now much more aware of what the state's doing.
Yeah.
We know what the state's doing. They're looting us. We're hearing about state capture. It's on the newspapers. It's on the websites. It's on all the rest and so on. If you work for a state enterprise and you're not a whistleblower, then you're just not paying attention. Because everybody wants to know what's going on. So the whole story's out there. What I want to get at is, you've got your policy adjustments. But does civil society as a whole react quite a lot quicker to this? Because if somebody's robbing you, you're going to get mugged once a month. You just don't take any money with you. You don't wear any jewelry.
Sure.
You have a crash helmet on and so on. Once you know you're going to lose assets, you start hiding those assets. Can civil society make this turnaround a lot quicker to force the state to stop going the techno or klepto-Marxism? I think that was your term. Klepto-Marxism. That's a great term. Can you stop this happening?
Yeah, so I think that's actually a very astute question, and I think that you're onto something there because, and it sort of harks to what I said right at the end of my presentation. A lot of what the state has been able to do to people for a very long time is being taken away. That ability for the state to do that has been taken away. Now, there's this funny debate about who invented the internet, right? Was it the government or was it the private sector? And I think that whichever way, there's two cool answers to that. Either it was the dynamic private sector, or it was the government. And if it was the government, it stands to reason because it's probably the largest strategic blunder that a government could ever make, right? So the internet. I mean, if you look at Brazil's hyperinflation in the 80s, and the 80s was not the dark ages; it was quite recently, but dissemination of information, understanding of monetary policy, the ability to not use the Brazilian real while they were printing it, the ability to get into dollars. I mean, that economy was quite dollarized, so some people, the elites, were able to hide. But the point is, the world has really changed a huge amount over just a very short space of time. And as I said, actually, you don't even have to use the Brazil example. You can use the Zimbabwean example. I mean, if the same thing were to play out in Zimbabwe now, it would be very, very different in so many ways. And information dissemination is far more powerful now. I mean, a lot of people know better than me, but it's this kind of extreme exponential increase in information availability now. So more data will be created in 2017 probably than has ever been created in history, or there and thereabouts. That's the kind of degree to which data and information is being disseminated. So yes, I think that for me, cryptocurrency, and again, no predictions on exactly how it's going to develop and take shape, but it takes away a massive leg of government control, a few legs actually at the same time. It's a bit of a three birds with one stone type effort, in the sense that it takes away the ability for a central planning Politburo to control the money supply. It also takes away their ability to potentially monitor transactions, and therefore to tax them. So that's really interesting, and also to ban certain things. So drugs are banned, but the famous Silk Road operation, which is pretty much where Bitcoin found its prominency, operated this incredibly sophisticated underground free market. And Silk Road got shut down, and was it Ross Ulbricht or something? He got put in. He got a massive sentence, and they were trying to send a message: hey, don't take these legs out from under the government. But of course, how many Silk Roads popped up after Silk Road closed? I mean, probably about 100, right? So ultimately, I think this can't be stopped, and I think that's really positive. I think that I take a lot of heart from the fact that that a lot of these solutions are being developed in parallel. And as I say, maybe fiat currency doesn't die with a bang, but with a whimper, and it does hyperinflate, because essentially, if you stop using the dollar, it will go to zero. It will become something that you frame on the wall. And that might be okay, because we just parallel move over into this very efficient cryptocurrency type economy, or some other kind of monetary technology. It doesn't even have to be crypto, it could be something else. So I'm very excited about where things are going, and I think the dissemination of knowledge is really, really important to all this. And the ability to be mobile with your wealth and with your assets makes government's life extremely difficult. The one caveat to all that I would say is that a wounded tiger doesn't go down without a fight. And so we're going to see the state fighting back. We're going to see them getting, they can regulate Bitcoin. They can try at least, and they can do it with some success for a while. And so even crypto can be in their purview for a while. So the states I think are going to fight back and push back, and to some extent it's going to be quite sad and ugly to watch, right? Because you're going to see these people fighting for their fiefdoms as technology just utterly overwhelms them, and people vote with their feet and with their capital and with their assets to be free. And these states are going to be clamoring to try and control everything that they just can't control. It's like trying to control the internet. It's too decentralized. It's too difficult to control. So there's some optimism there. I think there's some one or two scary scenarios there where governments fight back, and it's going to be an incredibly fascinating next 10, 20 years as we see the traditional function of the nation state as we know it arguably disappear in so many areas. That's going to be, and I don't know exactly how that plays out. I certainly hope it's for the better, and I think it will be. Yes.
Would you say that, I've got a couple of points here, that when you're chasing a cryptocurrency, you're actually chasing ghosts. You'll get there, and once you've grabbed it, there's another one there. And the point that you've been making is that they can't actually keep on doing it. Next point is that this country, I believe, there's more grant receivers than there are taxpayers, which obviously isn't sustainable. And we danced around it a little bit, but the big elephant here is a massive level of corruption that we've got. We've got a good constitution because we're able to actually sit in this room and do it without getting arrested. Let's make the point that there's many places you actually can't do that. And with the level of corruption we've got, that's one of the main things that's bringing us down. And if I can make a political statement, the best thing that could happen to this country is that Zuma goes to jail.
Okay, so the first was on the cryptocurrency. There was a famous quote by a Frenchman in the 1800s. And he said, give everyone the right to issue as much currency as they want, and it will be the best and most effective way to limit the money supply, which is a paradox But essentially, a free market for currency is I think ultimately, if we're committed to the idea of free markets in goods and services, we should be committed to the idea of free markets in currency, and that's what the cryptocurrency space is like now. It's an incredibly volatile frontier technology. Undoubtedly, there's scams. Undoubtedly, there's bubbles and busts, and so, strictly speaking, that asset class, let's call it, is not. It doesn't put its hand up right away and say, "Hey, I'm a great money." But that doesn't mean they're all scams, and doesn't mean they're all bad. And certainly, as I say, it's probably, I think we'll learn in time that it's the most secure form of money that we've ever known. Now, that doesn't mean that every cryptocurrency is secure and wonderful, right? And some of them can have protocols written into them where they can hyperinflate, or where they can change the protocol. And that's why Bitcoin is so powerful, because probably, certainly it's very difficult to see, but probably it can't be changed. There's no central authority that can actually change the Bitcoin protocol. So we're pretty confident that the Bitcoin supply will peak at 21 million coins sometime in the 2020s, and won't be able to be inflated anymore, and will mimic essentially a fixed supply of gold. Ethereum is different, and I'm not knocking Ethereum. It might end up being a wonderful technology, but Ethereum's protocol can actually be centrally changed a lot easier in any case than Bitcoin's can. So it's about being discerning and really understanding that space. But this notion that cryptocurrency is sort of a nothing in the ether, Ethereum, but that doesn't have any tangible anything. It's just a bunch of nothings. I think is wrong. It's actually it may be sound money for a digital age, and actually is limited in supply. Actually takes a huge amount of resources in Bitcoin's context to actually mine the stuff, physical resources. So you've actually got the makings of something very, very powerful. I'm not an evangelist per se for cryptocurrency. I'm talking about the excitement of where technology could head. I mean, who knows? Maybe in 5-10 years we've got something that usurps what we know to be cryptocurrency, if that were possible. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I don't know that. Maybe that's not possible. But technology, as long as the market is there finding solutions to our monetary problems, I'm great with that. Your second question, you're going to have to remind me.
This was about the grants
Yes.
exceeding the tax
It
base.
is, I mean, the numbers are less important than obviously how capable those few million taxpayers are to support the grant recipients. But yes, obviously it is a problem, and it basically harks back to what I was saying, that we're trying to create a very elaborate welfare state, and it's cart before the horse. We have to get wealthy first. We have to accumulate far more capital and wealth before we can do that. Now, I understand the political realities around some of that, and I think pragmatically, if you were going to do some big free market reforms, you would probably want to reduce social grants last. I think, because you're going to struggle to just, the free market guys have got it now, and you don't have any grants anymore. I mean, that's not going to go down well. So if I was playing the politics of that, try and reduce the size of government, but put Fikile and Balula out of a job, not take some guy in the Eastern Cape's grant away. So I think that's how I would play it. But yes, it is ultimately unsustainable, and something that we've really got to watch out for in South Africa, because that can't sustain for much longer. So that's an important one. And then the final
level of corruption. We made the political statement of saying the best thing that could happen to this country is that Zuma goes to jail.
Yeah, so I won't comment too much on the Zuma thing. My broad sense is that Jacob Zuma is actually is a storm in a bad climate. He's part of a much bigger problem. People talk about corruption a lot. It's a little bit like when you say we've got to fix corruption, it's a little bit like when people say, well, we've got to get more economic growth. Well, yeah, obviously, but how? What are you identifying the true genesis of where that growth is going to come from, or where that corruption comes from? Now, I'm not saying I have the exact answer on this, but my sense is that when you have an ideology that is okay with the rule of man, over the rule of law. That's essentially the backdrop ideology of the ANC. I just think corruption's inevitable. So I think the corruption is a symptom of the zeitgeist and the sort of policy zeitgeist of the ANC. Because once you set up all these nodes that are at someone's discretion, well, obviously you're going to get corruption. And if you were going to combat that, you've got to do some pretty special anti-corruption stuff, which I think would cost huge amounts of money, to put in place, and would arguably just settle the system with even more sclerosis and stagnation. So for me, the problem lies in the fact that, so for me, Marxism leads to klepto-Marxism rather than kind of the other way around. And as far as putting Zuma in jail is concerned, I mean, no comment. I don't have any comments on the legality of that. Perhaps.
Yes, thanks, Russell. Brilliant talk. Firstly, a comment and a question. And it's a clever comment followed by a stupid question.
There's no stupid question, only stupid people.
It's a clever comment. Some people are aware of what called the denationalization of money written in the late 1970s.
Yeah.
After he got the Nobel Prize, and he made the point to me personally and to others that he could write the book only when he had the Nobel Prize, because before that it would have been considered ludicrous. But after the Nobel Prize he had to be taken seriously, and I happen to have the manuscript with his final edits on, which he
that's
left
special.
me,
Yeah.
so
I'll be stealing that from your office on the way
but
out.
what he argued in it is that we're talking to the 70s, that there should be a currency that is not backed, that is not a specie currency like gold-backed or whatever.
Yeah.
He knew nothing about cryptocurrencies.
Course, yeah.
He said provided somebody could guarantee that there would be no increase, and he said the incentive would be they would be the issuer of money.
Yeah.
So big banks or whatever,
Yeah.
and his argument was, what now is cryptocurrency.
It was sort of a proto-crypto prediction.
Yeah, he was basically saying there's no reason why such a money shouldn't exist. In fact, he was recommending it, and then now we have a way of doing what he was saying could be done.
Yes.
The question is, cryptocurrency, many people, and in this room I see some people who are amongst South Africa's leading experts on the subject.
Yeah.
Keep talking about it being somehow below the radar. And I don't understand why. Why can't it just be regulated? If we were the regulator, we would regulate it by requiring audits. It would just have to be your assets, your trade, your income would have to be audited. And of course, like any other income, you could not disclose it.
Yes.
It would be technical fraud.
Yeah.
So I'm not understanding why advocates of cryptocurrency, and I'm one, I'm totally for it. I mean, it's brilliant.
Yeah.
Can't be regulated the way everything else is regulated,
Yeah.
by audit certificates.
So a quick comment on your comment, which is one fascinating thing that's happened over the last 30, 40 years, but actually really over the last 15 to 20 years, really the internet age proper, is the mainstreaming and the normalization of what was once considered wacko views, right? So I mean, you pioneered a lot of the space, Leon, in times when it was very difficult to do so. And schmucks like me come along in the 2000s, and we can speak to a much more receptive audience, and we're not such outsiders. You know, we're part of a clan now that's quite big and growing rapidly, right? So that's just phenomenal. And again, I think it's the strategic blunder. I actually hope government invented the internet, because it was such a brilliant strategic blunder. So the democratization of knowledge and of insights, I think, is absolutely fantastic. And yes, Hayek is just brilliant, and I think he did essentially foresee what we're seeing today. As far as Bitcoin regulation is concerned, I'm sort of holding back on my Bitcoin comments here, because I think I know enough to know how little I know. You know, I'm just maybe one stage beyond not knowing what I don't know. So I'm really cautious to get too much into it. But I think a lot of the government, there's a libertarian dynamic in the Bitcoin market, right? Just sort of by nature of what it is and how subversive it is, and a lot of tech people are also libertarians as well. So I think there's inherent distrust of government amongst a lot of Bitcoiners, not all of them. That's the first thing. I think there's a wariness, and it's well justified, to not trust government to get too close to Bitcoin or to any crypto. So I think that there's a sense with a lot of Bitcoiners and crypto people to say, hey, when government starts touching things and starts crowding in on our space, usually horrible things end up happening, and they don't want that. So I think that there's an inherent distrust. But technically, yes, I think what you said is absolutely feasible. I would just say that this is so subversive to the raison d'etre of the state that government. I'm not sure government will just come in and benignly regulate and allow these things to happen. Maybe, but there's going to be some period of tension here that this has to play out. So I wouldn't. Perhaps you're underplaying the subversive and adversarial nature of what this is still playing out to be. That's what I would say about that. Yeah.
Subscribe to sort of Schumpeter's view where entrepreneurs create real growth, right?
Yes.
And you are an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
Now my understanding is in South Africa, sort of the 60s, 70s, we had the 30% savings rate, the average consumer. We had low debt to disposable income levels, where it's sort of inverted now. We have a negative savings rate, 80-90% debt to consumer ratio, income ratio. It seems sort of we've indulged in consumption a lot, right? And I guess entrepreneurs look for the availability of capital to grow their own businesses, and I guess the society as a whole. So my question is sort of, do we have this dearth in savings in South Africa currently, where we've consumed and we're not investing and producing? Why has that occurred? And I guess then secondly, if you take that viewpoint where there is this scarcity currently, and why wouldn't you? I mean, you're a business owner yourself. Why not pack your things and go to the freest economy in the world and start there?
Okay. So the first question was, are we in a situation of a dearth of savings? And then the point B of that question was why. So yes, we are. People have very low liquid savings. The official savings rate that's reported by the Reserve Bank, I think, understates savings because it doesn't count savings with investment managers, pension funds, and a lot of that stuff, but it's not liquid. But in terms of actual liquid savings, South Africa is very, got just per capita just no money spare in liquid form in genuine savings. Not unlike the United States, by the way. I mean, the average American can't really cobble together at short notice $300, $400, $500, $600. So it's actually a global problem, and in a way, yes, we've been caught up into this global system of perpetually loose monetary policy, government and central bank policies that incentivize and drive overconsumption. In the sort of terminology of us economics geeks, it incentivizes having a high time preference, which means that you bring consumption forward as much as possible. You're not patient. Which, by the way, something like Bitcoin or a proper sound money absolutely reverses. So the lack of savings, I would say, is part of a global problem. However, post '94, and I mean this. Well, let's first, talk about the 70s and the 80s. You had very bad economic policy by the National Party, inflationary, highly consumptive, and a lot of a huge lack of investment confidence. So that happened then. We had a high consumption economy that turned around for a while, but unfortunately, and again, it's a political dynamic that we've had to deal with. But a lot of service provision and redistribution of wealth to poor South Africans has come at the cost of consuming capital. It's just the way it's been. It's the way that was funded, and maybe politically we've had to just say that's the cost of reconciliation to some degree. But a good example of that is Eskom. Consume capital, water, infrastructure, pipes under the ground. When you don't maintain them, you're consuming that capital effectively. So that's why we are where we are, and it is quite dire. And these notions that National Treasury comes out and says, we want South Africans to save, but we'll stop spending our tax money on that's a nonsense. Stop spending 1.3 trillion rand a year. Treasury on Twitter the other day asked for recommendations on how we can help South Africans save, and the answers were brilliant. I mean, they just came back and said, stop taxing us so much and stop being such clowns. So that was great. And then your final question was, why not immigrate? Personal question, very, very specific to the individual. How much do you love your country? How much do you want to fight for your country, in your country? But it doesn't even have to be a big emotional patriotic thing either. It can just be that you're excited to take opportunities overseas, and that's great. So I'm all for kind of immigrate, don't immigrate. If you're going to stay, try not to complain so much and do something, fairly constructive. I complain a lot, by the way, so that's sort of advice for other people. Do as I say, not as I do. The one point I would make is that it's hard to find a jurisdiction overseas that's great to go and live in. There's a lot of economies that if they don't have bad weather, they've got bad economics. But yes, Silicon Valley is dynamic. London's very dynamic. There's incredibly dynamic places that are great to go to, and I would just say it's an absolutely personal decision that people have to make. But it is difficult to operate here as an entrepreneur with a scarcity of capital, and it's one of the reasons. And maybe I should have even put it at the top of my list. We are so closed as an economy. Quick digression here. It took Europe, thousands of years to accumulate the capital that it did. And we don't have to, as people of European descent, for example, I don't crow about how rich Europe was and poor Africa was. It took them ages to do. I mean, it took them like 5,000-6,000 years, right? And it's taken the New World 150 years. That is the incredible magic of importing technology, importing capital, importing know-how. Now, I'm not making a statement on colonialism, but I'm just saying that whatever mechanism it comes by, that is a leapfrog capability that Europe didn't enjoy, right? They had to slog it out for thousands of years to get where they got to. So South Africa opening its economy to foreign capital, to skills, I don't know, Spanish entrepreneur, come and set up, do business, put capital into the system, employ people, make stuff. We've got to be way more open. So I would say, in a world that's trying to close borders to immigrants and so on, I would say, man, let's get people who want to come in and do business. So maybe more immigration and less immigration. Okay, there and then here.
Just a question. I mean, I live in Liberty.
Yeah.
Human liberty is a precious thing, and people we talk here about free markets and capitalism, but we live in a country where a lot of people, when you say free markets and private business and capitalism, it's like a swear word. It's like a skunk, and it's something that I know I experienced in my own family.
Yeah.
There's a real kind of pushback around the idea of capitalism and capitalists. Now I'm asking, how do we change perceptions in our society around free markets and the benefits of an open economy? Because I think it's a communication issue there, that those people that we kind of call klepto-Marxists have those people here around that kind of thing. And how do we, as people in the kind of private markets, private business, begin to, the issue around Gini coefficient, for example,
Sure.
it's quite high. So we've had 20 years of good economic growth, but poverty is still. How do we change that kind of?
So it's the best question all night. It's and the question for the recording is how do we better communicate the benefits of capitalism, essentially, and the benefits of freedom, and it's an extremely difficult question. Someone like Leon is one of the masters at it. It's essentially a propaganda exercise, and I don't mean that in a sort of horrible, we associate bad things with propaganda, but it's about communicating it clearly. The truth is that capitalism benefits the poor. That's the truth, and so we've got to find credible, succinct, clear ways of explaining that to people. And I've been thinking about this a lot, and I'm going to sort of fudge the answer because I don't have my thoughts fully lined up on it yet. But what I do know is that Marxists are excellent at communication. They use words very cleverly and actually very deceptively, and it's not something that comes naturally to people who love liberty, because we like to say what we mean. The word should mean what it says. So we don't use euphemisms as easily, which are essentially just clever lies, right? As easily as Marxists do. And that's something we've got to figure out how to get over, and use language that's really clever. We've got to claim, and I think what you're hitting on is something that I quite strongly believe, is that the intellectual argument only gets you so far. You have to speak to people's hearts, and you have to convince them of the, no one wants to change their belief if they believe that the thing they're changing to makes them a worse person, makes them a uncaring, horrible person, or a racist, or someone who's just an elite who doesn't care about the poor. When people transition in their ideas, they want to know that they can do that with a nice, clear, strong conscience, and actually raise the moral bar in their life. And I believe you can absolutely do that in converting, so to speak, from being a leftist Marxist to someone who loves liberty and free markets. Because when you dig into the essence of what these things are, they're absolutely beneficial to poor people, to everyone. They're absolutely moral. We need to claim the moral high ground, and we need to stop apologizing. One of the things I wanted to say tonight is we've got to stop apologizing for freedom. Stop apologizing for saying that I don't think we should tax rich people, all their wealth, and stop apologizing for having a view that inheritance tax is a bad thing. And so we've got to get a little bit aggressive as well. We've got to get up in Marxist faces a bit as well, because they're very, very assertive. And we just end up apologizing. There are so many poor people, so yes, I guess you have to have a socialist system. No, it's the exact reason why you don't want a socialist system. You can run a socialist system in Sweden because everyone got rich under the free market. So I think that we've got to push back. I don't have the full answer to your question. Leon's amazing at communicating. He just turns radical economic transformation on its head, and he says, we do need radical economic transformation, but this is the kind we need. So it's really good stuff. We do need to be more compassionate, not in the sense of, let's give you more money, but in the sense that, hey man, this is actually to your benefit. Minimum wages, minimum wage is a great example. What about the poor people on these low salaries? Okay, but what about all the people who are barred from entering the job market? So you can say to someone, hey, I care about the poorest of the poor. You just care about these poor guys who want more wages. I care about the guys who don't even have jobs yet, man. I'm right in the trenches with these guys. And you claim that moral high ground, you take it away from them in that debate, because what you'll see with Marxists is that they're all about the morality of the position, because the intellectual side of the position never holds up under scrutiny. So they jump in quickly on the moral high ground. You're a greedy capitalist. And we've got to find out ways to jump straight back and say, no moral high ground for you. At the very least, we're on the same playing field here. Now we're going to talk about these ideas. And I'm not someone who hates the poor, and I'm not a racist, and I'm not an idiot. So that's part of the answer. Before I go to the back, there was one here, and then I'll come back to you.
So, Raz, I appreciate why you said you don't want to focus too much on the central bankers, changing monetary policy is like what's going to reform South Africa. But what I am aware of, and I guess it speaks very much to what you're saying about propaganda and the narrative, is that. And it actually comes up in one of your charts when you did that continuum of central banking.
Yeah.
So, and I know that you didn't do this. I didn't know you didn't do that on purpose, but it's funny because on the one side you've got kind of state capture of the central bank, and on the other side you've got a banker's central bank. Now I know that's not the full continuum of central banking.
Yeah.
But in and of itself, that continuum speaks very much to the narrative game that Marxists or politicians are going to use exactly what you've got there to target the central bank.
Yeah.
So you say there that's on the continuum, mostly bankers. So maybe if we could just touch on a little bit why is it that the current system is actually not good for poor people? Why is it that this mostly bankers, and because it worries me that there's truth to the narrative that the central bank only serves the interest of bankers.
Yeah.
I'm not an anti-banker.
Yeah.
I'm just saying I understand that. Just because you've mentioned
I understand your question.
Yeah, how statists are so good at the narrative they'll claim this narrative because the system does favour certain people. So maybe just tell.
Okay, so let me concede right off the bat that talking about a mostly bankers central bank is like red rag to a Marxist bull, right? So I get that, and so maybe communication strategy in a different audience needs to be a little bit more nuanced. But you're asking a bigger question, which is, because I don't want a politician's central bank must mean that I want a banker's central bank, and that's not the case, right? There's a sort of triangle here of, well, you can have a banker's central bank, you can have a politician's central bank. Hey, you don't need a central bank. You don't need a central bank at all, right? You can have freely issued currency in a free market. The central bank is just the head of a banking cartel. And when those banks mess up, the central bank prints money and bails them out. I mean, can you imagine a manufacturing industry at a central bank? And when manufacturers made business blunders, this special manufacturing central bank would print money or I don't know, print more widgets for them so that they didn't have to produce them. That's what a central bank is to the banking system. And I think that it's quite a radical message that could resonate with some people on the left, that, hey, you don't actually need a central bank. Central banks, in the broader context, are superfluous. They're created in... Modern central banking was created in 1913 with the Federal Reserve. Yes, the Bank of England is much older than that, and the Bank of Sweden is much older than that. But basically, the modus operandi of the central bank is a conspiracy fact, right? It's not a conspiracy theory. A bunch of bankers and legislators got together on Jekyll Island and created something that would be a very, very clever mechanism to bail out the banking system. And I'm not even going as far to say that they did this as some big, wicked, grand, evil plot. I think they did it because maybe they thought it was a clever way to structure the financial system. And yes, it helped them out as well. It was a nice, cozy relationship. But it's morphed, as David Stockman says, into the biggest case of mission creep in history, right? The central bank started as this very benign sort of regulator of the financial system, and now we've got what the Fed and the ECB and all these guys are doing. And it comes down to what you didn't ask, but I know is in your mind because I know you well, this notion of how central banks need to create some inflation all the time. And we have an inflation target. An inflation target of 3 to 6% is actually just a wealth destruction target of 3 to 6%. I mean, that is what it is, right? Your money is actually losing value. That's not a good thing. And so that's what central banks do. They try and create a little bit of inflation that every year just scoops wealth and resources away from citizens. They protect the banking cartel, which is a special favored class of people, right? And industry. And if it's managed as well as it could be, then you have a system that's relatively benign, that you can still have growth and prosperity within, which is roughly what we've seen in sort of most economies that are managed by central banks. If you just do a 2 or 3% inflation every year, and your banks roughly follow the rules and don't get too crazy on irresponsible lending and so on and so forth, you can sort of muddle along in this zone over here, and it's okay. And so as far as a continuum goes, you could maybe add, you've got this continuum, and then you could go this way. Don't need a central bank, and good stuff over here, crypto and free market issued currencies. So maybe that's the way, part of the way to think about it. I think there is a communication challenge here, and it's, when you're a libertarian, so to speak, and I'm not saying that everyone here is that, but you've often got these triangulated issues, right, where you agree neither with the sort of left or the right, or even the Chicago free market guys, because sometimes they go a bit wonky as well, right? So you got to sort of sit in the straddled position where you're saying, well, actually, this is just one way of looking at it, but actually we don't need central banks. And I think that is a message that resonates, because the central banking system ultimately sucks in wealth and resources into a very narrow portion of the economy, creates boom and bust business cycles, which are very destructive. Even when you're on this side of the continuum, it can be very destructive. So that sort of answers your question a little bit, but it was, yeah, but it was a great question. Yes, at the back.
Thanks. I wanted to just comment on corruption, just as a part answer even to this gentleman's question. The people that are, most people in the country we live in, don't really understand, Russell, if you talk about the rule of man versus the rule of law, you know, that to them is just an intellectual.
Yeah.
But they do understand jail. So it's very important that corrupt people are sent to jail. And throughout Africa, one of our major problems is corruption. It does not matter whether you run a capitalist system or a socialist system. Corruption is a problem. So for example, in this country, all that's happening is very corrupt people are sucking the world out of the country. The economy is failing, and they are using us here to subsidize that system. So we will, the tax will simply keep on rising until they are taking 80% of it. But if those people who do that go to jail, it's one of the easier ways in which we can explain to people the evils of some of what is going on. So the example is important. If you look at Zimbabwe, the people in charge, in politics especially, because that's another thing about politicians, they are people who produce nothing, who want to tell the people who produce something how to take money from them. So they have destroyed these economies, and that's busy happening right now here. With no consequence. If a man can build a house or whatever for $250 million and there is no consequence, tell me what the next man in that position is going to do. He is going to spend $1 billion.
So I get your point, and I, in principle, obviously agree. I mean, you know, criminality needs to be sanctioned properly. I mean, I reserve comments on Jacob Zuma for fairly obvious reasons, in the sense that he needs to stand trial, right? I'm in the same movie as you. I'm just trying to stick. Tonight I'm sticking to a certain topic and don't want to make too many comments around. So, you know, I'm a very outspoken person. Maybe a glass of wine down, and I'd give you what I really think.
Can I get you a glass?
But I mean, the principle I think you accept.
No, I absolutely accept.
So when he asks you the top things, I would put, fighting corruption, especially in our continent, as one of the big things, because it sets an example and it becomes a message for people who don't understand some of the language we're talking here.
Yeah, look, I think
it's a great point. If you steal, you go to jail.
It's a great point, and my overarching comment is at a sort of very meta level. I don't know how to fight corruption, and maybe no one does. Maybe we need to decentralize that problem, and I don't know. Maybe there's an entrepreneurial solution to fighting corruption. Or maybe just the way that maybe just removing money out of the hands of the state is a huge way to fight corruption. So your principle is absolutely correct, and when you run by kleptocrats, I mean, there's a realpolitik dynamic there, which is interesting potentially. So, A, how do we get someone like Jacob Zuma, if he deserves it, into jail? B, is it the best realpolitik course of action? And people will have the disagreements about whether you should eschew the morality and just play the realpolitik of it. But if the equation was something like, Jacob can go and live in Beijing for the rest of his life, and then everything gets fine in SA, I might take that trade. But equally, I agree that. but
because I think it says exactly what we don't want.
So I totally hear that. I totally hear that argument, right? And so you might convince me that actually no, we need to set the principle. However, in the realpolitik of it, if we try and set that principle, and maybe we get a Mugabe situation, which we don't want. So tricky. I don't have the answers, but your point is absolutely spot on. Anyone else? Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.